Francisco. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Welcome to America to Crossroads. It's our 106th consecutive week of programming. Welcome from Jews United for Democracy and Justice and from Community Advocates, Inc. And from our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, Xavier Oslovsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lair, and myself. Tonight, we present the extraordinary American statesman, Secretary Leon Panetta, in conversation with the always incisive and probing Warren Olney. Thank you to both of you for being here tonight and helping us better understand our topsy-turvy world. The unspeakable events of yesterday in Uvalde are saddening beyond words for all of us, especially for the families of those children who were lost. In today's judge emails, the one I sent earlier and the one which will be sent at 6 tonight, you will find a link to the impassioned plea for action by San Francisco Warriors head coach Steve Kerr. We commend the short recording to you and trust that each of us will do what we can to actively support and promote his message. Next week, we present the prolific and brilliant Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post. Jennifer, a graduate of UC Berkeley, where she was valedictorian of her law school class, practiced law for many years here in California before she transitioned into the journalism world, focusing on opinion writing, first for the Weekly Standard and then for commentary, and then for the past 13 years for the Washington Post. Next week, she will talk about Roe v. Wade, the January 6th committee, and more in conversation with Madeline Brand. The week after, on June 8th, we focus on inflation, the economy, and its likely impact on the 2022 elections, midterms, with Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalist David Leonhardt, who has covered the economy for the New York Times for more than a decade. We hope you'll join us. And now here's David Lair, my partner, to tell you more about upcoming programs and to introduce Mel Levine. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Janice, and welcome back. We missed you last week. As I mentioned last week, we have an amazing, probably unparalleled lineup of speakers in coming months. The week after David Leonhardt of the New York Times, whom Janice just mentioned, we welcome back Ron Brownstein, one of the nation's leading polling experts. He's a columnist at The Atlantic and a senior political analyst on CNN. In the wake of major primaries over this past and the next few weeks, and the breakneck speed of political events, his analysis is always timely. In subsequent weeks, we'll hear from the New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker and his wife Susan Glasser, the author of the New Yorker's Letter from Biden's Washington. They are the premier pundit pair in DC, and they're also mavens on Russia, where they both lived as key American journalists. US politics and Russia, topics on everyone's mind these days. Baker's colleague at the New York Times, David Brooks, will join us in July. That evening with Brooks will be followed by best-selling author and one of the nation's preeminent social psychologists, New York University's Jonathan Haidt. He'll tell us how and why American society got into the combative, tension-laden pickle we are in today. And if you have any questions, just glance at the end of the program. We'll have a list of virtually all the future speakers into July, so it's really worth watching. It's now my pleasure to introduce a longtime friend, a former congressman and member of the Jews United Executive Committee. He has been a crucial help in securing many of the speakers we have hosted over the past 2 years. Mel Levine. Mel?
Unmuted. Okay. Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted now? Okay. David, thank you very, very much. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Leon Panetta. I was going back and trying to remember exactly when he and I first met, and I believe it was in 1966, some 56 years ago. And although in the decades since then, as he has served our country in an extraordinary career, the Leon Panetta that I knew in 1966 has fundamentally not changed. After serving in Congress for 16 years, then as director of the Office of Management and Budget and chief of staff for President Clinton, and then head of the CIA and the Department and Secretary of Defense under President Obama, Leon remains the same plain-spoken, candid, straightforward, common sense person with a great sense of humor that he was when I first met him 56 years ago. When Leon isn't serving officially in various positions representing our country, he is working closely with his wonderful wife, Sylvia, at the Panetta Institute for Public Policy at Cal State Monterey Bay. I believe Leon is probably especially proud that the district that he represented in Congress is now occupied by his son, Jimmy Panetta. Leon will be interviewed by another friend, Warren Olney, our most frequent moderator, who is the host and executive producer of To The Point and To The Point's Climate Change Update podcasts. Warren and his programs have been honored with nearly 40 national, regional, and local awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Radio and Television News Association. So to interview and moderate the discussion with Leon, I lateral it to Warren.
Mel, thank you so much for that lateral turnoff. I much appreciate it. And just want to remind the audience, welcome to you, first of all. And secondly, if you will contact David Lehrer, you can submit your questions to him via email, and he will send them then to me, and I will ask them of the secretary, starting in about 35 or 40 minutes. In the meantime, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. It is a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you always. And I'm just delighted to be with you once again. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Warren. It's an honor, really, to have this opportunity to be part of this town hall. I really think that it's critical, particularly these days, that there be forums to try to discuss the critical issues that face our country and our world. And this town hall has a tremendous reputation for doing exactly that. So I want to thank everybody who's participating, and particularly thank those that are involved with the town hall for putting it on.
Okay, thank you so much for saying that. I feel the same way. Let's start by talking about what happened yesterday in Texas. I don't think we can go forward any longer in a public venue without referring to that. Again and again and again, we hear in the news coverage, heard it last night and we hear it now today, that this is a uniquely American problem. The total number of mass shootings this year, depending on how you define them, I suppose, is said to be 213. So what's the message to the rest of the world when that situation exists?
I think America sends a very tragic message to the rest of the world about our society and about our respect for each other and respect for ourselves, really. We are a country that is arming ourselves to the teeth. I think people in the last few years, each year have bought something like 20 million arms of one kind or another. Imagine 20 million arms that people have been buying. And the problem is that there is very little political support to be able to take the steps that are incredibly important to trying to bring some rationality to what's happening. I was in the Clinton administration. I was proud of the fact that we passed effective gun control, that we passed an assault weapons ban, that we were able to pass other steps to try to control guns, and it was effective. It was effective. The reality is we didn't have these mass killings after we passed those laws. But when they expired, we went back to this incredible kind of undisciplined approach to allowing people to just get whatever arms they needed. They now get assault weapons, and we've seen them in use in these mass killings. And I guess the most disappointing thing is that despite tragedy after tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, that although all of the politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, always say the right things about the horror of what has happened. But then within a few days, there's almost this kind of a 15-second attention span that suddenly disappears. The issue disappears. And rather than the parties, rather than the president and parties coming together to try to at least pass something that indicates we care about each other and we care about what's happening, it's almost lost. It is lost. And I guess that's the most depressing thing of all. Obviously we're all impacted by the fact that 18 kids got killed yesterday, as well as others. 18. I can't imagine being a parent and having to deal with that kind of loss. But I almost feel that even the greater loss is the inability of our political system to be able to respond. The dysfunction in our system is incredibly worrisome because it relates to democracy itself. We as a country, as a democracy, can't survive unless we are willing to come together and face the problems that we have to deal with. And so I worry today a lot more about the inability of our democracy to be able to function in a way that will address this terrible and tragic issue.
That's a terrible thing to have to say, but I certainly couldn't agree with you more. When we can't even get background checks passed, when 90% of voters apparently would approve them if they were in fact, and they're not thought to be all that effective anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that the key right now is to try to get something adopted that puts at least some discipline in place, whether it's background checks, whether it's dealing with some of these weapon systems. I don't know what the answer is, but I really think it's incumbent on the people we elect to understand that they cannot just simply walk away from this issue again. And I say that about the president as well. I mean, I know Joe Biden. I think he really feels the pain of what has happened. But I think this is a moment in time when, very frankly, the president might have to act on his own in some way to try to address this terrible issue. Because if we don't, if we're suddenly bottled up and can't move anything because of the opposition, because of the gun lobby, because of all those that for whatever reason don't want to impose anything on anybody, I think that we're asking for another mass killing to take place within another few weeks.
You say if the president might have to act in some way. What way would it be? What is there that he could possibly do that would have an impact on this?
I almost feel that we've reached a point where the president, through an executive order, which obviously would be challenged in court, but let the people challenge it in court. But I think some kind of executive order that either provides for these background checks or does something with regards to assault weapons, something that indicates that we are not just going to stand back and let nothing happen. I just think this is a moment in time when an extraordinary step needs to be taken by the president to try to address this issue.
There are people who are saying, and this is particularly true of politicians in Texas, that we ought to arm the teachers and arm the people in the schools so that, and apparently there was a guard at this school yesterday who was ineffective in stopping the man who did the shooting. But what do you say to that kind of proposal?
Well, I have to tell you, if I had young children in school, I would want that school to have security and to invest in whatever it takes to be able to protect our children. Because very frankly, I worry that what happened yesterday in Texas could happen anywhere, any way, in any community across this country. I think it is incumbent on school officials. I think it's incumbent on local politicians to make sure that security precautions are taken in order to stop what happened yesterday.
But then there was a shooting in Buffalo in a supermarket not long ago. Do we have to be in armed camp?
You know, if we are not willing to govern ourselves, if we're not willing to take the steps that need to be taken in order to try to provide the protection needed so that we can live lives without worrying about whether or not we're going to face a mass killer. If we're unable to do that, then obviously in the paralysis that's taking place in our democracy, we still have to provide security. We still have to take care of our kids. We can't say to hell with it. And yes, you know, we may move towards being an armed camp, but in the very least, I'll know that my children are being protected by guards at that school who are giving them half a chance so that they can live their lives without having to worry that in a few seconds they could lose their lives and their future and everything that we love about them. That is just not the alternative that we ought to take, which is, you know, let's just you know, it's tragic. We'll go to the funeral. We'll say some nice words, and then we'll all move on. As you heard Chris Murphy on the floor of the Senate. We cannot do nothing. We cannot afford to do nothing. We've been doing nothing for too long.
Well, thank you for that. And it's hard to move on from there, but I think it's time to do so. And I want to ask you about Ukraine and what's going on there. First of all, do you think that Putin's army is doing so badly that there's a real chance that he might lose that war?
I think that there is a real opportunity here to defeat Russia in their decision to invade a sovereign democracy in the Ukraine. I would have never said that before Putin decided to invade, because you know, if you looked at the intelligence, if you looked at what most people predicted of the Russians, if you look at what Putin himself probably thought would happen, that within a few days they would take the capital and they would bring down the government in Ukraine. That did not happen. And it didn't happen for a number of reasons. One were the inherent weaknesses within the Russian army in terms of command and control, in terms of logistics, and in terms of weaponry. They just did not have the fighting capability that, frankly, we all gave them credit for. And as a result, what I consider kind of several phases here in the war in the Ukraine. Phase one was the fact that an invasion was stopped by the Russians. The Ukrainians, because they're great fighters, because they proved to be very, very courageous and brave in defending their country, something that a lot of people did not anticipate either. But the combination of a very weak Russian offensive and a very aggressive and effective Ukrainian defense resulted in stopping that invasion. That was phase one. Phase two, the Russians then turned to total destruction of that country, blowing up cities and towns, killing people, engaging in war crimes, because they wanted to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky, that did not happen either. They failed at that. So we're now in phase three, which is that the Russians have retreated from Kiev. They're trying to establish some kind of offensive in Donbass and in the eastern region of Ukraine. They're finding that difficult to do because of their lack of capability to put together an offensive. And also the Ukrainians, because we are giving them the weapons they need, particularly artillery, but other weapons as well, are proving very effective at being able to stop their efforts. So we've entered what I consider now to be a war of attrition between Ukraine and Russia. Russia will make some gains and then fall back. The Ukrainians will make gains. They'll continue to push forward. I think we're headed in one of several directions. Number one, that the Ukrainians are able to really arm themselves and conduct an offensive that literally pushes Russia out of the Ukraine. That's possible. Still tough to do, but it's possible. The second is that that the Russians, Putin decides ultimately to try to resolve this situation with some kind of negotiated settlement that allows Russia to get some areas in the Ukraine, but essentially allows most of the Ukraine to return to being a sovereign democracy. I don't know that Putin is prepared to do that at this point. And I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are prepared to allow the Russians to gain any of the territory that they fought for. So the third option is that Putin decides to escalate this war because he's cornered, because he can't go anywhere, and decides to use either nuclear weapons or chemical weapons of one kind or another, and dramatically escalates the war because he has no other choice. That's a possibility as well. I think right now we are probably looking at a continuing and prolonged war of attrition. How long it goes on, no one can tell.
You said a war of attrition between Ukraine and Russia, but what is the threat that, or the possibility that Putin might decide that it is in fact a war between the United States and Russia? We've committed $54 billion in just 2 months. That's an extraordinary amount of assistance, and he's in trouble. And even within his own military, and even occasionally on the state TV, there has been criticism of the war. What is he? Are we pushing him in the direction of nuclear weapons or chemical and biological weapons?
Look, there is no question that the United States and our allies, our NATO allies, are doing everything we can to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. That is exactly what we're doing, and that's exactly what we should be doing. Because frankly, Putin for too long assumed weakness on the part of the United States and others. And that's why he marched into the Crimea. That's why he went into Syria. That's why he went into Libya. That's why he conducted the cyber attack against our election systems, is because he never paid a price. And finally, and I pay tribute to President Biden for his leadership on this, President asserted world leadership, pulled our allies together, and said to Putin, if you do this, if you make the decision to invade, you will pay a price. And that's exactly what's happening. He is paying a price for his aggression of a sovereign democracy. And that's what needs to happen. Look, I don't, and I don't think anybody else ought to kid, we ought not to kid ourselves. This is a dangerous situation. And it could escalate. There's no question it could escalate because it's a war. One missile that goes astray, one bad decision, and we could be in the middle of a world war. There's no question about that. But I also believe this is extremely pivotal in terms of the 21st century and where democracies are headed. Because very frankly, what happens with the Ukraine will tell us a lot about what happens with democracies in the 21st century. I often believe that World War I, in a very real way, kind of set the table for the 20th century in terms of the power struggles that went on. And I think the Ukraine war in the 21st century can tell us a lot about what happens in the 21st century and whether or not democracies have a real chance to be able to survive and to confront autocracies in the future. This is what's on the line. This is what's on the line. And therefore, I don't think the United States and our allies have any other choice but to do what is necessary to support Ukraine in this war. Implement the sanctions, implement more sanctions if necessary, provide the weapons that are necessary to confront the Russians, and reinforce our position in NATO so that we send a clear message to Putin that if he crosses the line, we will defend ourselves. Those are the messages that have to be sent to Russia. And for that matter, I have to tell you something. Those are the messages we have to send to China, to Iran, and to North Korea as well.
Let me ask you about China. And although I hesitate to move away from Ukraine, what you've said is so challenging and so important. But you've mentioned China, and President Biden said when he was in the Far East just recently that yes, he responded to a question that he would in fact defend Taiwan militarily if China were to invade it. That was considered very unexpected by many, at least, and reported that way by the journalistic people who were with him. Is it all that unusual? Is it unexpected? Or has that been the prospect all along, even though we've been purposely vague about it?
You know what, I cannot imagine Joe Biden having made clear that we are going to do everything necessary to stop the Russians in Ukraine, trying to hedge his words with regards to China and Taiwan at this point. I think he would have been heavily criticized, very frankly, if he was ambiguous about the position of the United States when it came to Taiwan. So I think, frankly, he said the right thing, which is that the United States will do everything we can to try to help Taiwan if China made that decision. That's an important signal to send to China. Now, having said that, I think the White House, by trying to redefine what the president said or clarify it, in many ways kind of weakened the message that the president was trying to send. I think if the president's going to send that kind of message, everybody in the White House ought to be on the same page. Otherwise, it appears to be confusing. So I'm glad he said what he said, but I think everybody has to now join together and make clear that what the president said is exactly what United States policy is right now.
What about China, and how is it liable to respond to that? And is there, given recent history of China and the US and the way that the president of China has behaved, is it something they should have expected?
I think that China right now, frankly, is in a troubling time. Number one, I think she supported Putin prior to the invasion because he figured, like everybody else, that Putin would succeed quickly and that he would be on the right side. And now he finds himself on the wrong side. And so you can see that she is kind of holding back on trying to provide any support to Russia because he doesn't want to be in a position where he gets the same kind of sanctions that we've imposed on Russia. It would destroy their economy. Secondly, I think China's made a mistake in the way they've handled COVID. The shutdown of their country and what's happening in Shanghai is atrocious in terms of the way they're handling it. And the people of China themselves are obviously resisting and reacting to it. Thirdly, their economy as a result is having problems. And when the Chinese economy has problems, Xi really has problems in terms of his position. So I think Xi is at a time when China, frankly, is not as strong as it once was. Now, China is let's make no mistake about it, is a competitor, an adversary in some ways. We're worried about what they might do in Taiwan. We're worried about the South China Sea. We're worried about the fact that they're putting more money into weapon systems. And so they do remain a threat. The best way you deal with Xi is the same way you deal with Putin, which is to make very clear that the United States and our allies are not going to allow China to push their way around into other countries and to push the way around in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. That's a message that has to be sent. So I think President Biden did the right thing to go to the Pacific, to reinforce our allies, the Quad, to reinforce our other allies in the Pacific, so that in some ways what is happening with the United States and NATO in dealing with Russia and what they've done in Ukraine, that what Biden is trying to do is to replicate that positioning with our allies in sending a clear message to Xi that we are not just simply going to stand back and allow China to push itself around and avoid abiding by international rules. So I think it's the right signal to send to China at the right time.
There's an isolationist sentiment in this country. There has been for a long period of time. And what do you say to people who say, we have no business in the South China Sea, we shouldn't be there in the first place, and in fact, we're too involved in Europe? How do you respond to that? And to people who say that we're being imperialistic and it's time to rein that in?
Well, we've just been through a period of time where people were arguing that we should kind of be withdrawing from the world. I mean, basically, President Trump argued for an America First policy. Yeah. It was essentially isolationist in nature, which was, we shouldn't get involved with our allies. We shouldn't get involved with other countries. We shouldn't be playing a role of world leader in the world. And it was very much the same kind of isolationism we heard before World War II, that somehow the United States didn't have to pay attention to the threats in the world. We didn't have to pay attention to Nazi Germany. We didn't have to pay attention to what fascism in Italy was doing or what was happening in Japan. But we found out that ultimately our national security would be threatened and that we had to respond. So ever since World War II, the United States has played the role of a world leader. Truman established NATO to basically try to bring the world together in order to contain the Soviet Union, and did it successfully. And we have engaged with the rest of the world to try to confront other adversaries of one kind or another. American leadership has been critical in the world, and particularly a dangerous world. And if we kind of pretend we don't have to play that role, then we're just putting our head in the sand. And ultimately, we will have to face that threat. You don't deal with Russia in dealing in the Ukraine, then you're going to have to deal with Russia coming at us, undermining our institutions, cyber attacking our infrastructure, and basically weakening the United States. Now, you can either provide world leadership working with our allies to be able to confront our adversaries, or you can try to go it alone and ultimately pay the price by weakening our country. I think that's the lesson we've learned from isolationism. And that's why I'm a believer that the United States has to play the role of a world leader in the world. And very frankly, if we don't play that role, nobody else will. That's why the United States needs to provide that kind of leadership.
Before we go to the audience questions, I just want to ask about one more looming crisis. There are plenty of them around. As we said at the beginning, this is indeed a topsy-turvy world, and I'm getting a little topsy-turvy with the computer here, but what about climate change? It's often said that crises move very slowly for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden they move really fast. And certainly the United States and Russia and China are going to have to collaborate if we're going to ever actually do anything about climate change, whatever else we can say about shorter term solutions to that problem. How do you think about that, and how would you address it?
You know, we have to deal with the world as it is. You can't pretend you're dealing with a world that's not there. And while obviously it is important to be able to work together with other countries to deal with climate change, to deal with COVID, to deal with disease, to deal with hunger, to deal with poverty, that's frankly the kind of world I'd like to see in the 21st century, is a world where we are working with Russia, with China, with other countries to problems that are facing humanity in the 21st century. But the problem is that you're dealing with countries that are operating on their own agenda. I mean, Putin decides suddenly to make the decision to invade a sovereign democracy. You know, I was a kid in World War II. I cannot imagine that we are now involved in a European war where another tyrant like Hitler 70 years ago has decided that people do not have the right to decide what kind of country they want, what kind of government they want. That's what Putin said. Hitler said that to Czechoslovakia and the rest of Europe. You don't get to decide that. Well, I'm sorry. We live in a world in which we ought to respect the right of people to make that kind of decision. So when Putin makes that kind of decision to invade, we have to respond. And frankly, we have got to do everything to weaken Putin because he represents that kind of threat. And with Xi in China, Xi has basically said, we're going to take the place of the United States in the 21st century because he sensed weakness on the part of the United States as well. We have got to say to China, look, we're going to draw the line. You're not going to be able to be aggressive. But at the same time, if you want to have dialogue, if you want to work on economic issues, if you want to work on trade issues, we're prepared to do that. But you have to negotiate with these kinds of autocrats from strength, not from weakness. That's the key. So you need to establish a strong alliance in the Pacific. You need to send a strong message to Xi that he's not just going to have his way, in order then to ultimately be able to work together on issues that we have a mutual interest in, whether it's trade, whether it's the economy, whether it's issues like climate change. Look, in order to be able to get to these human issues, we've got to make clear that we are prepared to do what is necessary to protect our national security, to maintain a strong defense, to maintain a strong diplomacy, and to be clear to other countries that if they are prepared to work with us, we will work with them. But if other countries want to be aggressive, if they want to go to war, we've got to have the capability to respond to those tyrants who decide that they're going to make the world their playground. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen as long as the United States is around. So if we want to deal with these other issues, we are going to have to be strong. We're going to have to confront those that want to threaten our national security, because the only way we're going to get to being able to have the kind of world where ultimately we all do work on problems that affect humanity, we're going to have to get rid of the bad guys. That's the bottom line.
Let me go to the audience, and I have questions on my cell phone that I'm getting from David, and there are plenty of them. I want to go first to Marion. Marion says, do you agree with Kissinger's comment that the West should give Russia a bit of a win in Ukraine and some territory? I haven't seen that attributed to Henry Kissinger, but apparently Maureen has.
No, I think I read kind of Kissinger's comments, and look, I mean, he's a very pragmatic diplomat. I get it. That's the way he's operated through most of his life, and he says, you know, look, you want to get Russia to kind of cut a deal here, you got to give them something. But I also think that what Henry's not paying attention to is the fact that the Ukrainians have been fighting for their lives every day. They've been getting killed. They've had their cities destroyed. They've had civilians, innocent men, women, and children getting killed horrifically by the Russians. There's a poll in the Ukraine where 82% of the Ukraine says they're not going to give any land back to the Russians. You have to respect that viewpoint because they're the ones that are fighting. They're the ones putting their lives on the line. So, you know, if we can support Ukraine in that effort, and if we can put up a tough and aggressive fight to make clear to the Russians that they will not succeed, and I think that message is now getting through to the Russians. If we stay unified and we stay strong, I think ultimately that's the best way to get Russia to come to the negotiating table, not to simply throw something at them in order to pay a price that frankly they have not earned.
Betsy has a question that may go to you as a former head of the CIA, although that was a long time ago that you had that position. She wants to know, why do we constantly overestimate Russia's capabilities? She says we've done that as far back as 1989 before the wall fell. And why are we doing it today? She wants to know.
Yeah, it's a good question because frankly, I think you know, the intelligence that I had on the Russian capability showed that the Russians, you know, were a capable fighting force, and that if they decided to invade, that they could probably bring together not only the warriors that they needed, but the weapons that they needed in order to get the job done. I think what happens is that in the intelligence world, if we really do not have good sources of information in what we're looking at, then we kind of take where they're at for granted based on past information. And I think what happened here is that we did not have people who were in the Russian military providing the kind of critical information that we saw. I mean, the Russian military was being depleted. They were relying on one-year conscripts to man their military. Imagine one-year conscripts. You can't train in somebody for war in 1 year. You just can't. But that's what they were doing. They were relying on old weapon systems. They had poor command and control. And so we really didn't have somebody in a critical place to make clear that that was happening. And very frankly, I think the Russians were operating on the same information. They were not getting the kind of reports that they needed, that Putin needed, to really understand whether or not he really had a strong army or whether he had a weak army. So intelligence, the value of intelligence depends on the sources. And if you have the wrong sources, you're going to get the wrong intelligence. And I think that's what may have happened here.
Barbara wants to know, what can we do to open up the port of Odessa and get the Ukrainian grain flowing?
Yeah, that's a great question because as we know, and we've seen in these last few days, the danger of horrific hunger taking place in the world as a result of bottling up all of the wheat and the breadbasket of the world that's out there. I think it's something like 20,000 tons of wheat that are being stored. And because these ports are closed, we're not able to get the wheat out. I really do think that we ought to be looking for alternatives to moving that wheat, whether we do it by train and move it into Poland and then ship it out of Poland, or whether we move it by truck, or whether or not we're willing to bring together the capability to go in and provide the ships necessary to be able to go in and get the wheat and come out and protect those ships in that process, which is obviously a lot riskier. But I think we ought to be looking at alternative ways to move that wheat. You know, we did the Berlin airlift at a time when Russia basically tried to stop anything from going into Berlin. And the decision was that we were going to do it by air, and we did it very effectively. I think in this situation, we have a responsibility to make sure that wheat keeps flowing and that we are able to provide that to the rest of the world. So I hope that the administration is looking, along with our allies, at other ways to be able to move that wheat.
We've got people who are very interested in what's going on here in this country. Bruce wants to address internal threats that the U.S. faces. Marcia wants you to talk about the likely outcomes of the midterm elections, and maybe there's a relationship between the two.
Well, you know, at our Panetta Institute, we have an Institute for Public Policy here in this area. And I just went through a lecture series where I looked at the midterms. And I had, I mean, the first one, I had Karl Rove and James Carville.
Wow, that's a good combination.
And it was a good lecture.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that in all of the lectures I had, it's pretty clear that people are very concerned about what's going to happen in this midterm. And that, you know, when you look at the polls, when you look at what's happening with inflation, when you look at the attitudes of people who, for one reason or another, just don't feel like their problems are being dealt with, there's a real concern that that if this situation continues, that we could lose the House, Democrats could lose the House, and you know, perhaps even lose the Senate. Senate is probably going to be much closer, but still lose the Senate. And that would be, you know, that would be a tragic outcome, certainly for Joe Biden in his ability to be able to lead the country in these next few years. So I think recognizing that this could be one of those pivotal elections, and I've been through those. In the Clinton administration, after 2 years, we passed the budget, we passed all kinds of bills, we passed gun control, and then paid a price. We lost both the House and the Senate. But Bill Clinton somehow was able to ultimately work together with the Republicans and was able to still get things done, got welfare reform done, was able to get some budget things through, did child health care. And so it's not like the end of the world, but it does make it a lot more challenging for the president to be able to govern. I think it's really important for the president to do everything he can, and I know he's trying to, but it's tough. He's got to try to deal with the inflation threat. He's got to try to deal with, I mean, this baby formula thing is frankly something that I think blindsided everybody in the administration. Although, you know, you could see it coming. If you only have 3 companies producing this stuff and you shut one down, you know, you better worry about whether or not you're going to have enough baby formula. Somebody didn't do that until the shelves were empty. So you've got to be able to respond quickly. You've got to show that you're willing to deal with these issues. What happened yesterday in terms of the killings that took place, I think the president has to show he's willing to take action to try to deal with that. I really think that this is a moment in time when the president and the Democrats have to really come together to try to confront some very difficult issues, not just walk away from them. Because I think if you just walk away from them, I think we're headed towards a wave election in November.
So you're speaking as a Democrat, obviously. What is it about the Republicans that you find not just dangerous from a partisan standpoint, but more broadly than that? Why would it be bad to have a Republican administration?
You know, I really believe that important to our democracy is the ability to have two strong parties. And frankly, during most of the time I was in Washington, we had two strong parties. Why? Because they shared the same values. Did they have differences on approaches? Of course. Did they have some differences on how you try to resolve some issues? Of course. But when it came to the fundamental values of the country, the importance of education, the importance of healthcare, the importance of getting a good job, the importance of having a strong economy, the importance of being able to provide for our families. You know, that both parties pretty much had the same values. And that's what allowed both of them to be able to come together and to govern, because they trusted one another. They were able to find consensus. They found compromise. And they were able to resolve issues. That's the way our democracy is supposed to work. But what's happened in these last few years is that because of the partisanship and the polarization, it's become very difficult to get both parties to be able to work together. And the Republicans in particular, because of Donald Trump and his approach, what happened in the last election, and the fact that he continues to say that he was elected and that all of what happened was a big lie, and it undermines those values I talked about. And I think the Republicans are struggling to figure out, you know, many of them would like to get back to the basic principles that the Republican Party stood for. You know, they supported the Constitution. They supported law and order. They supported the fact that, you know, we had to take care of the budget and reduce the debt. You know, they had some principles that they were about. And I think there are some that would like to get back to that. But there's also a chunk of the party that basically is allowing Trump to pull them around by the nose. And so they're supporting these ridiculous conspiratorial theories that are not only lies, but that undermine stability in our democratic system. And so if some of them get elected and they try to impose these kinds of ridiculous conspiratorial theories in the rest of the country, they'll destroy our democracy. It's that simple. They'll destroy our democracy. So I think the Republicans are going to have to figure out what kind of leadership are they going to support in 2024? And frankly, the Democrats have to do the same thing. We need to have new leadership in both parties so that both parties are looking ahead as to what can the United States be in the 21st century? Not looking backwards, but looking forward. I think that's what we need.
Do you see people that you think are the kinds of leaders that ought to be taking over?
Yeah, no, I think those leaders are there. I'm very impressed with some of the members that I see in the Congress, some of the senators that I've had the opportunity to deal with. There are some governors that are working in the country that are outstanding.
You're not using any names.
No, I'm not saying any names because frankly, none of them have really had a chance to kind of step up and be and be recognized for the things they're doing. But I think they ought to get a chance. I think we need younger leadership all the way around because, this is a challenging world. None of this is going to be easy to try to resolve. But what I want to get back to is electing people who are willing to govern the country, not to just pound their shoe on the table, not to just express an ideology, but are willing to govern, which means sit down, listen to others, and try to develop compromise in order to resolve issues. That's what saved our democracy for over 200 years. We've got to get back to the business of governing.
I think you're describing what you called earlier a non-functional democracy. Maureen remembers that phrase and wants to know, how do we get that way?
It's, there's a lot of things that contributed to that. I think the fact is that during most of the time that I was in the Congress and worked in the Senate, I was a legislative assistant to Senator Tom Kuechel. Some people remember that name.
Sure.
He was a minority whip under Everett Dirksen. And there were other moderates in the Senate on the Republican side, and they worked with Democrats to work together on issues and achieve some landmark legislation. When I got elected to Congress, Tip O'Neill was the speaker, a Democrat from Boston, but he had a great relationship with Bob Michel, who was the minority leader. And did they have their political disagreements? Of course. Did they fight each other in elections? Of course. But when it came to big issues, they felt they had a responsibility to work together. And so that's the difference, that there were members largely located center right, center left, who were willing to come together and resolve those issues and get things done. What has happened is that the parties have moved to the extremes for several reasons. I think redistricting has probably fed into that. If you create safe seats, safe Republican seats, safe Democratic seats, then what happens is Republicans worry about somebody running to their right. Democrats worry about somebody running to their left. And so it tends to move the parties more to the extremes. And we're losing the center as a result of that. And to govern, you need to have a vital center. You need to be able to come together and resolve issues. So I think both parties have moved further to the extremes. Secondly, I think the funding in elections is largely uncontrolled funding that now goes into elections. PACs provide a tremendous amount of money. Most PAC money is not interested in changing the situation or changing the issues that need to be changed. They basically like the status quo. And so they become a tremendous influence in terms of what happens in the Congress and impact on lobbying tremendously in terms of governing the country. That's another problem. Social media. We are living in the information age, but social media has made it totally undisciplined in terms of the information that is going out to people. And so the social media is being used by the extremes to basically send their message, even if it's not truthful. And it gets out there and it undermines stability within our country and our society. So it's very difficult to be able to really try to find that consensus when social media is constantly undermining the ability to come together on important issues. And lastly, takes leadership. I tell the students at the Panetta Institute, we govern either by leadership or crisis. If leadership is there and willing to take the risks associated with leadership, and make no mistake about it, if you want to be a leader, you're going to have to take risks. You may even have to take risks that offend some members of your own party. Tip O'Neill was never afraid to do that if he felt that the interests of the country were more important. You can't put party ahead of nation. You've got to be able to provide strong leadership. Otherwise, we will govern by crisis. and too often we have been governing by crisis. So all of those are areas that have contributed to this terrible situation, and obviously add to that political polarization and the fact that there are people out there that are trying to divide America. That is their goal, is to divide America and to create hate and create fear and create vengeance and create prejudice. And when you have those goals, as we saw implemented on January 6th on the attack on the US Capitol, it tells us how fragile our democracy really is. So there are a lot of things that have contributed to this situation. But I really do believe that this country, ultimately, our whole history, we faced crisis. And I think we can have the leadership come forward to again face the crises that we're in.
We always try to end on a positive note, and I think you've provided it along with what you're teaching the kids at the Panetta Institute. So Secretary Leon Panetta, I just want to thank you very much on behalf of the sponsors of the program for being with us. And it's been a lot of fun for me, and I know it has for the audience as well. Many, many thanks. Come back again.
Warren, thank you very much. It's been a great treat. And as I said, I think these kind of forums, these kinds of town hall meetings are absolutely essential to our democracy, mainly because, as I said, social media creating these distortions about issues and what needs to be done. This is an opportunity to really try to find the truth. And ultimately, democracy doesn't work unless you can agree on what the truth is.
Thanks once again. Next week, it's Jennifer Rubin with KCRW's Madeline Brand talking about abortion to everything from abortion to January 6th to Ukraine, a pundit's view. That's next Wednesday, June 1st at 5 o'clock Pacific time, of course. Thanks very much for listening today and watching, and be safe.